Good morning. It is 9:30 and time to resume the hearings for the examination of the Greater Norwich local plan. This would be a good time to switch mobile phones off or to turn them onto silent. Can everyone hear and see me okay? Good. My name is Thomas Hatfield. I've been appointed by the Secretary of State, along with Mike Warden, to hold this examination and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations with regard to soundness. The Programme Officer for the examination is Annette Feeney, who you are likely to have already had contact with. Outside of the hearing sessions, any contact you make should be through Annette. This morning's session relates to Matter 13 and will cover all proposed employment allocations. It's not my intention today to cover matters that have already been discussed in the first 2 weeks of the hearings. Instead, the discussion will focus primarily on the site allocations themselves. As previously stated, we will not be considering the merits of emission sites during the examination. Our guidance note outlines the procedures to be followed at the hearing sessions. This morning's session will run from 9:30 a.m. to around 1 o'clock, with a short break taken midway through. The hearings will be in the form of a structured discussion, which I shall lead, and the agenda will follow the matters, issues and questions that have already been published. The purpose of the hearings is not to cover all matters or concerns that have been raised, as we are already aware of these from the written submissions. The hearings are for us to explore certain matters further to help us come to our conclusions. There are some issues where we already have sufficient information from the written statements, so there will be little or no discussion on those matters. Please bear this in mind. If you wish to speak on a certain matter, please use the raise hand function on the toolbar and I'll come to you at the appropriate time. Can I also ask that participants please give their name and any organisation they represent before speaking for the first time. That will assist me and those watching the sessions online. Finally, there is a potential issue with the online stream again today, so Annette will be recording the session in Teams as a backup in case we need to upload that later. However, if that recording is not required, it will be deleted in accordance with data protection regulations. Okay, we'll be working our way through the MIQ list today in order under Matter 13. So I'll deal with issue 1, the sites in sequential order, followed by the same approach under issues 2 and 3. In which case, the first site to discuss is. Sorry.
So do you want me to introduce the team for today?
Yes, apologies. That would be helpful. Yeah. Thank you. If the partnership could introduce the team.
So the main team today will be Samuel Walker, Samantha Jones, Carol Baker, and Adam Banham, each dealing with different levels of the hierarchy. So they'll be coming in and out at different times. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Morris. Okay, we'll deal with issue 1 first. Site A, which is obviously Norwich. 8 in the MIQ list, local plan reference GNLP 1061R, which is land known as Site 4, Norwich Airport. So let me call it up in my list of sites. Okay, question for the partnership to start with. Well, a point more, I should say, than a question, just to thank them for the statement of common ground that came through yesterday. That's probably cleared up the majority of the questions I wanted to ask about this site and is helpful in that regard. With that in mind, are there any other comments people want to make about the site itself before we move on to the detail of the policy wording? Like I say, the statement of common ground has addressed most of the points I wish to raise. Okay, thank you. In which case we'll go on to discuss the policy itself. In the first instance, I did ask for a track changes version of the policy to be circulated. Is that available yet? I did see the proposed changed version of the policy that the partnership wished to produce, but it was in well, there's no track changes, so it wasn't entirely clear how it would change from one version to another. Is that something the partnership was able to produce at all?
Not as yet, Inspector.
I believe a colleague is working on that at the moment. Hopefully it should be ready soon, sir.
Okay.
If you'd like me to run through the general emphasis of the changes, or would that be helpful, sir?
Well, obviously some of the points were easy to pick up from the PDF. There are obviously substantial changes. It's more the fine detail points that can easily be missed in the absence of a track changes version. I suppose the main one that was obvious from the start is the change in site area and the change in hectareage. It's a reasonably minor change in the grand scheme of things. Presumably that reflects the recent application. Is that the case?
Yes, so the recent application on the document that we provided to you, which is D2.16B, which is the land ownership plan, the current application is the area outlined in red. It doesn't include the area outlined in green and blue. However, the proposed allocation is the area outlined in red and the area outlined in blue. The area outlined in green is not included in either the application or the proposed allocation. With regards to the hectareage change in the policy, this is it's a very small amount of hectareage, and I think that's to do with the boundary drawing. It's essentially roughly the same area, but I think that there was minor errors in the original drawing of the boundary, and this is clarified through this plan provided by Barton Wilmore. Hopefully that's correct, Gareth or Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Wilson,
so Gareth Wilson, Barton Wilmore for Norwich Airport. Yeah, that is correct. The application boundary, the current application that's live is 36.79. That's the red line. The blue line is 6.87, and that represents the wider part of the draft allocation that also reflects the airport master plan area that was produced and endorsed by both councils.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Walker, do you wish to run through some of the other changes that have been made and introduce those, please? Thank you.
Yes, sir. I think the most important change to draw to everyone's attention is the allocation as submitted has the requirement, criteria 1, that non-aviation development will only be permitted where it's demonstrated that there is insufficient demand over the next 40 years for aviation-related use. However, this is not consistent with the now adopted master plan or the ongoing planning application, which I believe should be. It's not determined at present, but its determination is pending soon. So it's considered by the partnership, both Broadland and Norwich City Council, in agreement with the site owners, that the allocation should reflect the content of the master plan adopted there. It wouldn't be appropriate to be in conflict with that document, sir. So the revisions to the policy essentially are focused around that change to enable a 50-50 split between employment use or general employment use and aviation related employment use within this policy. The general employment use is considered necessary to act as a catalyst to bring forward the aviation related use on this site. So the changes to the policy criterion detail the acreage of employment use and airport related employment use to be reserved. It also covers access and transport matters, sir.
And I picked up the point about the airport surface access strategy that was now required prior to the occupation of more than 30,000 square meters, whereas before that it was prior to the occupation of the development from memory. Okay. I mean, looking at the representation submitted on behalf of the airport, there were 5 adjustments sought by the airport in relation to the policy, and that's itemised at 2.37, or such as summarised at item paragraph 2.37 of the statement. Does the revised wording as put forward by the partnership now overcome the concerns of the airport? Has it been agreed with the airport as part of the statement of common ground?
I just wanted to double check those points. I believe that those points are all now covered. They were agreed beginning of this week, end of last week. I believe we've covered all of those. Would that be the same opinion of the landowner, Mr. Wilson?
Yeah, I can confirm that items 1 to 5 on paragraph 2.37 are now resolved to the satisfaction of the rights of the landowner.
Okay, that's helpful, and we'll shorten the discussion considerably. Okay, in which case I'll await the track changes version just to see all the detailed changes. I don't have any issues with the substantive changes that have been discussed, and I'll ask that those be added to the list of main mods. Are there any other comments on this site from any other party? Okay, thank you. In which case, I think I've got everything I need from this site. Thank you to the partnership and the land promoter on that site.
Thank you.
Okay, move on to site B in the MIQ list, which is local plan ref GNLP 0331 BR. Again, just give me a second to call it up in my documents. Okay, so this is the small westerly expansion of the Norwich Research Park. Again, in the main, I've got what I need from the hearing statements on this site, really. There's just one minor brief comment from myself in relation to the policy wording. It's one that we've heard before with relation to the Norfolk Minerals and Waste Core Strategy policy that just being moved to the explanatory text.
Thank you, sir. I'd thought that might happen. I have that in my notes that would be, so I will tick that off as something that we shall do. So yes. Okay.
I mean, I'll probably keep raising it because it's in my notes now. So I'm afraid that's the script I'm working to.
Yeah, I think it comes up on most of these. So thank you, sir.
Okay. Are there any other comments on this site from anyone in the room? Okay. I think when it comes to general comments on the wider research park, I think we'll deal with those under policy COL1 because that's the umbrella policy in effect, which covers the wider site. So I think where the parish council, for example, has raised concerns about the cumulative impact of this site and the proposed allocations within it, I think those cumulative issues will deal with under the umbrella policy. That seems the most logical place to do so. Okay. So in the MIQ list, site C, which is local plan reference GNLP 0331 CR, again south of Norwich Research Park extension. That's the largest site to the southwest of the existing research park. Again, I've got probably all I need from the hearing statements on this one. And there's just the same point about the minerals and waste core strategy in the site-specific policy. Are there any other comments on this site from anyone else in the room? Okay. In which case, we'll move on to site D in the MIQ list, which is local plan reference GNLP 2109.
I'll pass over to my colleague Adam Benham now, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Walker. Okay. Again, with this site, my questions are detailed in nature and relate to the policy wording itself. Just with regards to part 2 of the policy, it requires submission of a master plan to accord with any master planning for Hethel 2. Couple of questions there, really. What's the purpose of requiring a master plan for a site of this size in the first instance? And in the second instance, has any master planning been undertaken for Hethel 2 that could be taken into account? So a response to both those points, please, from the partnership.
Yes, morning, sir.
Morning.
The logic behind the policy is obviously that it's a small site directly related to a much larger site. So our thinking was simply to tie the two together so that the overall approach made the best use of the land and was correct in all other ways. I'm not aware of a master plan exercise having been completed for the Hethel 2 allocation. We have had a statement of common ground from the promoters about its continued promotion, but to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen that detail because I don't think that detail exists.
Okay, thank you. It's a detailed question and a detailed point, really. I understand where you're coming from in the sense that you would want the allocation and the development of it to tie in to the much larger site to the west, but it's whether the site itself requires a master plan. Being only 0.79 hectares in size, it might only contain 1 or 2 buildings. So does the site itself require a master plan, or in order to achieve the outcome you're aiming at, does it just need to have regard to any master planning on the adjoining site? Would that get you to where you want to be?
I think it would, sir, and I think also within the policy we do have several other clauses around, for example, the nearby listed building and landscaping. So I think, yes, sir, I think just reference to would be sufficient.
Okay, and I suppose the other issue is if there is no master plan yet at the adjoining site at Hethel 2, then there's nothing to have regard to. But then I suppose you've covered that with the use of the word any. As long as the policy isn't read in such a way where this site is in any way perceived as being prevented from coming forward prior to the adjoining site, perhaps the wording should be have regard to as well as accord with, because if there's a master plan for the adjoining site, it couldn't technically accord with that because it wouldn't be covered by it. I think have regard to any master planning of the adjoining site at Hethel 2, I think would be perhaps a clearer form of wording from my perspective. Does that sound? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that would be useful. So I hadn't thought of the issue that way round. We have had schemes come forward at Hethel which have been approved on adjacent sites. The site next to this is referred to as Turing Park. So we haven't had a situation where requirements have blocked development coming forward, but I recognise the wording, and I think that's something we would seek to change along with your suggestion, sir. Okay,
I think it's a detailed point for clarity, but if you're open to that, I think that should be added to the list of main mods. I'll leave it with the partnership to reflect on the precise wording.
Thank you.
A detailed point again on point 3. There's a general point first. I think I made this comment yesterday. I don't like the terminology as required by the Highway Authority because, as I set out yesterday, it implies that in order for any development to accord with this policy and therefore the development plan, that the agreement of the Highways Authority is secured. Whereas obviously there's a route to challenge the opinion of the Highway Authority through the appeal process. And you could be in the unusual situation of an inspector finding that the highway solution was acceptable, but that it was still contrary to the development plan because it wasn't in accordance with the requirements of the Highway Authority, which is a perverse scenario to be in, really. So I think throughout the plan, with that point in mind, terms such as required by the Highway Authority or in agreement with the Highway Authority need to be deleted and be phrased in the context of the needs of the road network or highway safety rather than the requirements of the Highway Authority themselves. Off-site improvements, is there anything specific in mind? That's the first part of clause 3. It's a very generic requirement at the moment.
I believe the junction in mind is where Potash Lane meets the B Road to Wyndham running east-west, but my colleague Phil Morris, I think, has a point to add.
Yes, so sort of fairly hot off the press in relation to highway works. detailed design work on highways and site enhancements is actually being undertaken and paid for by the county council as we speak, and that will deal with the junction arrangements. There's also some work being undertaken by the county council on investigating cycle access between this site and Wyndham. And just while I'm updating, there's also been energy master planning for the Hethel site, which is being funded through the Community Renewal Fund.
Okay, so is it envisaged through part 3 of this policy then that there'll be a contribution to those projects? Is that what the policy was driving at?
I think it's in part been overtaken by events because that design work is underway, and any funding of it will be done through SIL and other funding sources. I think on a site of this size, the contribution will be minimal, but in the same way, a site of this size is not going to have any great impact on the highway.
Okay, perhaps it just needs to say then any necessary off-site highway improvements, something like that. I'll leave the detailed wording with the partnership then. Okay, part 4 is historic environment. Obviously, there's been a heritage statement for this site. I think just to capture the findings of that heritage statement and to embed them within the policy, the text that's in the Statement of Common Ground Historic England should be added into this section. It refers to the height of development as well, and like I say, incorporates the findings of the heritage statement. So I think that needs to be added in as well. Point 4. Okay, those are the comments I had on policy GNLP 2109. Are there any other comments on this site? Okay, in which case we've concluded issue 1 and we'll go on to issue 2. The first site itemised under this issue is there a change of the guard at the council?
Yes, sir. It's me again.
Right. Okay. No worries. Okay. The first site listed is site A in the MIQ list. Local plan ref R1. Land at Neat Market, Hall Road. Let me call this up in my document. Okay. Again, in terms of the principle, I've got most of what I need from the hearing statements. So my comments really are limited to the policy wording itself. Again, these are detailed comments. Question on part 3 of the policy. I think this links back to this point I've raised in other site-specific policies about clarity and ensuring that wording is precise rather than vague. It says that, excuse me, development should preferably be approached comprehensively. Obviously, the word preferably is vague. Is that a requirement or not? But more than that, my understanding is that part of the site has already been developed for a car dealership, which if that is the case, then it would prevent comprehensive development in any event. It is the aim of that part of the policy. And like I say, when you read it through, it refers extensively to an existing livestock market. Is the aim in effect to ensure, obviously comprehensive development isn't possible given that part of the site is developed. Is the aim to ensure that any partial development doesn't conflict with the livestock market? Is that the overriding aim of this part of the policy?
That's correct, sir, yes.
Okay. Perhaps then it would be better and more effective, or effective full stop, if it referred to something along the lines of any partial development of the site should ensure compatibility between proposed and existing uses in terms of noise and disturbance. And that would avoid singling out the livestock market, albeit I don't live a million miles away from the livestock market. I appreciate they're not the quietest of uses.
Okay, I accept that point, sir, and we shall make that amendment or propose the amendment.
Okay.
With regards to the dealerships I had a point down here where it would be preferable to remove that element from the allocation now, as it has been completed since submission of the plan.
So the modification to redraw the site to exclude it.
Yep.
Yes, I suppose, because if you're assuming, for example, this site is 4.51 hectares towards your employment land supply and part of it's no longer available, then yes, it does need to do that. And obviously that would reduce the hectareage, albeit that the partnership does have quite a significant surplus in that regard.
Okay, I'll put forward that as a proposed amendment as well, sir.
Okay, and that would definitely be in the realm of main modifications. Part 4, this is again a detailed point. It requires retention and enhancement of existing trees. It's difficult to see how you would enhance an existing tree, so perhaps just the word and enhance, well, the 2 words and enhancement should be deleted.
Agreed, sir.
Okay, again, point 6, development should include the construction of the main vehicular access road into the site as part of the first phase. And my comment was going to be, well, it seems like the first phase is completed, which is the car dealership. So is that road now in place?
I would need clarification on that, sir. I'm afraid I don't have the detail on whether the access that is required is provided for the whole of the site, whether it's just for that dealership. So I would have to take that away to get clarification on that, sir.
Okay, I think perhaps if the aim is to redraw this allocation, and I think that's necessary given part of it's no longer available, then perhaps just revisit that requirement in the light of that redrawing. Does that requirement still make sense if part of the allocation is no longer present? Okay, and part 8, again, previous comments apply with regards to the minerals and waste cost strategy policy. Are there any comments on this site for anyone else in the room? Okay, in which case we'll move on to site B in the MIQ list, which is local plan ref COS3/GNLP SL 2008, which I'll just call up. That's the Longwater employment area in Cossey.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I've got a few questions on this site, on these sites, I should say. Some of them are points of clarification more than anything else. The first one is, what precisely are the boundaries of this site? Because certainly when you look at the map that's embedded within the Part 2 local plan, and also on the very helpful map that's provided on the partnership's website, which superimposes the allocations on what looks like a Google Earth image, it appears to comprise at least 4 separate parcels. If I understand it correctly, those being the COS3 allocation, and certainly when you click on COS3, on that interactive map, it highlights 4 sites. There's then a separate, well, GNLP SL 2008 appears to be separate again, but has its own reference number that doesn't appear to be COS3. Am I interpreting that map, or those maps, I should say, correctly?
That is correct. So we are planning to group those together. Probably, if when adopted, the references would be coherent, so they would all be under the same reference number. The COS3 are the existing areas of allocation in the South North adopted plan. The SL 2008 is a new area proposed, and these all fall within the wider allocation COS4, which is I think it's a purple dashed line that covers that wider area. But the COS3 are the elements that are, and the SL 2008 are the areas for new developments. We also have Mr. Carpenter on the call, who said he's been instructed to speak on behalf of the landowner on this one, if we have any further questions that Mr. Carpenter may be able to provide assistance on.
That's likely to be the case, and in the first instance, it's just so I can understand the I mean, I suppose the first question is why have those sites, which appear in some cases not to relate to one another, why have they been grouped together in one allocation?
This is as they are in the adopted plans.
Okay, so it's a carry forward from the previous. Is it South Norfolk at this, or is it
As-
broader? No,
It's South Norfolk at this.
I know the two
Cost-
districts meet at around this point, don't they?
Yeah,
Okay,
this
Norfolk.
would be within South Norfolk. So.
Okay. How are these sites identified? What's the process by which they were identified as allocations, aside from other areas of the wider COS4 site or area, I should say?
I just asked for my colleague, Mr. Morris, to provide assistance on that, sir.
The long water employment area is a very long-standing area, and you'll see from the maps and your site visits that much of it has been developed. It was originally mineral workings, and some of the uses on site still relate to that old use. And so the COS3 elements in the South Norfolk local plan, I believe, are simply the undeveloped, or the sites that are they're either undeveloped or they're suitable for redevelopment within the wider boundary of the allocation. And that wider boundary is referred to by Sam, is the sort of purple and blue dots and dashes.
Presumably these are all sites in different ownerships. Is that correct?
I think they are, yes, sir. I can't confirm that. Maybe Mr. Carpenter can, but I'm pretty sure they'll be in different ownerships.
Well, before we bring Mr. Carpenter in, I'll just say what I gleaned from the representations. I mean, there's no statement of common ground for this site, and the one representation that had come in appeared to relate solely to site GNLP SL 2008. Mr. Carpenter, if you can assist further on that point, it would be appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, sir. Certainly do my best. Yeah, as Mr. Morris said, this COS4 was the subject of a planning application many years ago. I think 1993 it was originally granted to a consortium of landowners, and the consortium brought forward the development with all of the infrastructure and the road improvements in particular. Since then, those individual landowners have then been selling off land for development, and so you see on site now what has been developed as a consequence of that outline planning permission. What is left is, as Mr. Morris said, is what has not been yet developed, and the individual landowners are promoting or marketing those sites that are left. So I act for Bullen Developments, who own parts of COS3. It's difficult without sharing screens to point out which ones those are, but
It'd be helpful if you could describe it to me, Mr. Carpenter. I'll describe to you what I've got in front of me, which is again, I'm using the partnerships very helpful interactive map.
Yeah.
And you have if you exclude GNLP SL 2008, which is the southeasterly most portion outside of the settlement boundary, yep. Which I'm clear on who owns that, and I understand it's subject to a recent planning permission. There's then the 4 residual elements. There's the smaller elements, which is roughly rectangular, towards the southeast of the site, yes, closest to GNLP SL 2008. You've then got the larger site to the north, northeast of the wider COS4 site, the big open area in the middle, and then the area that appears to overlap with what looks like an aggregates or mineral site on the western periphery next to a roundabout. So which of those parcels do Bullen control?
Bullen control the smallest of those COS3 areas, together with part of about a third of the area to the north of that, and that's the third of that area is to the western side of that plot. And then Bullens also control the larger open area in the middle.
Okay. And all of those are available and are
Yeah.
intended to be developed for employment purposes from your perspective, Mr. Carpenter.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So much of Bullen's land has been developed within that area. Those are the areas that are left, and there are ongoing discussions and have been for several years. Some of them come to fruition, and others don't. But importantly, they are available and they are serviced.
That's very helpful, because I was struggling. I mean, where I'm driving at all those questions is A, to understand the grouping of the sites, the history of them, and B, to assess availability, really. So I think what I've heard from both Mr. Carpenter and the partnership is very helpful in that regard. It did strike me, looking at these, again, mainly from aerial photos and using that beloved tool of planners, Google Street View, that the central sites and the smaller sites to the east of that look to be the two most obvious development plots, and obviously Mr. Carpenter's confirmed that they are indeed being promoted for that purpose. In which case, I suppose my questions really then focus on that larger northern site, which Bullen appeared to own the western part of. I mean, the question I had when looking at this was that it wasn't clear how the boundaries had been drawn, because certainly when and perhaps it's helpful if others look at what I'm looking at, which is the map feature on the GNLP's website, which if you click on the Reg 19 publication version at the bottom of the screen, you then have the option, click on document, map or evidence base, and it's the map that superimposes the allocations onto an aerial photograph effectively. And like I say, it's the two sites that Mr. Carpenter's client owns in their entirety look like fairly obvious development sites. The two that are less clear are the one on the northern periphery, which on the map I'm looking at has COS 3 in the centre of it. It's not clear what the boundaries of that site relate to, and it appears to include an awful lot of land that looks like it has existing uses on it, and there appears to be a road and access route going through it, and then there's again, it's the southern boundary of that site. I just don't understand. It appears to cut down below the access road and then cut partway across a load of existing uses. It's not clear how that's been drawn and how much of it's available. We've heard that around the western third of it is available, and that, again, from the aerial photograph, looks like the most obvious and the least utilised part of the site. But if the partnership's relying on the whole site and proposing to allocate the whole site, it's not clear what the justification for that is. But I'll take a comment from the partnership on those observations if they wish to come back.
I can't answer exactly why the boundary is drawn where it is. That is the existing boundary. The reason for allocating the site is that many of the uses in that northern part are suitable for redevelopment. I'm struggling to understand why we wouldn't reallocate what is parts of a very successful employment area.
I think the point I'm driving at is perhaps looking at it slightly differently, really, is that in order to allocate it and therefore rely on it as part of your employment land supply, there must at least be some indication that it's available and likely to come forward. I mean, we have that on areas of the site now, which is helpful. We've got the representation from the owner in relation to GNLP SL 2008. Mr. Carpenter's clearly signalled his client's intention with regards to some of the central elements of the site. But if you're going to allocate a site for a purpose and rely on it in your supply, you must have at least some justification for it being available or likely to become available at some point within the plan period.
Yes, sir. But as you said, we have a very large supply of employment land. So in terms of deliverable supply, whether this site comes forward early in the plan period or late in the plan period, it doesn't affect the supply. Indeed, losing it would not affect the supply. As we've noted and you've noted, we have a very large supply. What it will affect, perhaps, is the ability for the landowners to bring forward development. It wouldn't be by any means impossible, but it would be helpful if they are recognised as being within the allocation area. If you feel that to be sound, this area should be deleted, then we would have to consider that. But I think it's likely that certainly parts of without breaking it down into even smaller elements, I think parts of the site are likely to come forward for redevelopment in the planned period. Parts of the area you're concerned about, the parts of that northern area. So yes, I can't really add to that. We're in your hands in some respects. Well, in many respects, we're entirely in your hands. So
it's the point about allocations being available. There's no point. I mean, it would be all areas within the wider COS4 site are covered by policy COS4, and there's an encouragement of certain types of development within the wider COS4 area. But these are specific allocations within COS4. I appreciate these are historic allocations, but is it clear that that historic rationale still applies is where I'm coming from? Have circumstances on the ground changed such that the allocation boundary should be changed? It's obviously the case from Mr. Carpenter's perspective that there is an area within that larger part of the site towards the northeast that is proposed as a, or is it intended to come forward? Mr. Carpenter, did you wish to come in?
Yeah, if I can help with some of the history, I think Mr. Morris and I are probably the only ones who have been around long enough to remember how this all came about in the first place. But certainly, yes, from Bullen's perspective, all of the land is vacant and available, except for a very small part of that northern area, which is used. It's sort of the residual of some of the sand and gravel workings, but there's nothing stopping that coming forward as part of development at any particular time. So that's off William Frost Way. The remainder of the area I can't speak to. The remainder of that northern area I can't speak to because we don't own that. But certainly the way this whole Longwater Park has developed over the years is that it was allocated way back in whenever. Planning permission was granted for the whole area, including the area that you're concerned about, understandably. And then uses have moved away, or been moved around the site to accommodate development. So whether the landowner in that particular case is going to be similar to other landowners in the previous and operators on the site that see it as we're operating, but we have intentions to move on. I don't know, but that is how Longwater has developed over the years. Users have chosen to move on because it was allocated for employment development, and they've seen an opportunity and develop the site for other purposes.
Okay, and William Frost Way itself, I mean, that it's just the boundary that site doesn't relate to. Does William Frost Way, does it post-date then the allocation of that northeastern part of the site? Because it doesn't appear to take account of it, the boundary.
No, William Frost Way is part of the infrastructure that was put in as following the original allocation. Although I think William Frost Way to the north there peters out a little into less of a tarmac road and more of an access track serving the uses at that end of the site. So you can imagine as a sand and gravel workings and ancillary uses, this whole area was at one point covered by lots of tracks, accessed only by large HGVs. So William Frost Way is tarmacked up to a certain point, but then peters out into a rather less formal road.
Okay, I mean, it's a southern boundary of the site that just doesn't appear to follow anything. I mean, again, I'm going off aerial images here. I'll visit the site with Mr. Warden in a couple of weeks. It just appears to cut halfway through a whole series of existing industrial or commercial uses. I'm just struggling to understand why the site boundary has been drawn. It's with that northeastern part of the site, clearly at least part of it is available. other parts, the boundary just doesn't seem to make sense to the situation on the ground today.
Can we take that boundary issue away, sir, and have a look at it?
But by all means, I'm not saying that the entirety of that area of land isn't available. Clearly part of it is, but it just doesn't seem to make sense to me, that boundary at present. And it might be that circumstances have changed since the original allocation took place and new uses have come in. Mr. Carpenter, did you wish to come in and make a supplementary point?
No, sorry. I was only about to say that it is quite a few years since I've been up at that part of the site, so I'm not sure what is going on there at the moment, other than what I've just described for Bullens.
Okay. The other site that is a bit of a mystery as well is the very western edge of the site, which again from our photographs appears to just incorporate part of what looks like a quarry or an extraction of some sort. And it cuts right across bits of it and incorporates quite large areas of what appear to be mature trees and planting. It's not clear what that relates to. So if the partnership are going to go and have a look at the boundary from the other site, then I think that's another one that's entirely unclear how the boundaries have been drawn and whether it's available, unless there's something I've missed which the partnership wish to draw my attention to.
I think that's one we'll take away again, sir, because I don't have the I don't have the knowledge to explain exactly why the boundary is where it is. I suspect it's got something to do with the way the sand and gravel workings has grown since the original boundary was drawn. But we'll go and have a look at that one.
Okay, thank you.
I suspect on that point, sir, Mr. Morris is absolutely right. That used to be the old batching plant, or a batching plant of several on the site, and I think probably things have changed since the original allocation. But yeah, let's look at the boundaries.
Okay. Okay, that's been a helpful discussion. I want to move now on to the detailed policy wording. I've got again some detailed points. This is a very detailed point in relation to part 2 of the policy, and it's just the way it's worded and how it cross-relates to the definition of employment uses that's given in the Appendix 2 glossary of the Part 1 plan, where employment is defined as, in effect, what was B1. Obviously now within Class E, B2 and B8. And here it says other employment uses that are not identified as main town centre uses, which really is B2 and B8, you would have thought, especially for the car showrooms and petrol filling stations. So obviously it isn't referring to B2 and B8 and is using a different definition of employment uses from the one that's given in the glossary to the plan. I just think that term needs clarifying, because I read that and thought other employment use is not town centre. Well, town centre are offices. That's the only employment use that's an office. That's town centre use. But then obviously it's referring to a wider pool of uses beyond just B2 and B8. It's a point of clarity really. If the partnership can take that away and have a think about it, that would be appreciated. Apart from that, 6 we've discussed previously in terms of wastewater infrastructure capacity. If the partnership can review that as per the comments on previous sites. And again, the comments with regards to Part 8 made elsewhere apply here. In other words, move to the explanatory text, please. Okay, any other comments on this site before we move on? Okay, in which case we'll move on to Site C in the MIQ list, which is local plan ref KES2/GNRP 0497. From my perspective, it's detailed comments on the policy wording. Point 2, is that wording to be agreed with the Highway Authority. As previously discussed, that should be deleted. Part 6. Part 6 just appears to be conflating different issues in the sense that it says inclusion of ecological appraisal, which obviously relates to ecology, with off-site strategic landscaping northwest of the 1113 as buffering to the CWS and Nature Reserve. Well, I suppose if it's buffering, then it is related. So perhaps that's an error on my part. The issue is that land in third-party ownership? If it's requiring strategic landscaping outside of the allocation on the other side of the B road, is that land available to deliver that strategic landscaping?
Is it over just check with the colleagues there?
By all means, yeah. By all means.
I think that it is within one ownership, sir, but we can go away and double check that. We believe it is all within one ownership.
The only concern from my perspective is if it were in a separate ownership and therefore couldn't potentially be delivered. If they're in one ownership, there's no concern from my perspective. It's just to make sure that requirement is capable of being ensured. Okay, if partnership could check that.
Will do, sir.
And parts 7 and 9 relate to matters we've previously discussed, so just a note to pick those up here.
Thanks, sir.
Okay, we'll move on. Are there any further comments, sorry, on that site before we move on?
Not for me, sir.
Okay, we'll move then on to site D in the MIQ list, which is local plan reference AYL 3. Land at Dunkirk Industrial Estate, west and south of Banningham Road, Aylsham.
It's a change of personnel from the partnership, so hand over to Adam Banham. So.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Okay, this is quite a small site within the middle of an existing industrial estate. There's no statement of common ground for this site. Does the partnership know who owns it?
We've had difficulty contacting the owner of this site, so the answer is no to that, sir.
Okay. What's the history behind its allocation? Is it a long-standing allocation that's been rolled forward in successive plans?
It is a long-standing allocation which was certainly allocated in the last plan and may have been before that. It's part of the wider Dunkirk employment area, so it's got well-established nearby mainly sort of light industrial businesses there. So our view was to keep the allocation because it obviously provides for choice in the market for employment land, and indeed keeping the allocation avoids the risk of, for example, inappropriate residential development on the site. The site is located within the settlement boundary.
Well, the purpose of employment allocation isn't to prevent residential uses in an industrial area. Presumably, if the site is surrounded by existing industrial uses, which appears to be, then residential wouldn't be appropriate anyway. Is the wider employment area in the lower order plans subject to some sort of blanket employment area or primarily industrial area designation? Because in some areas I've come across, you have a twofold approach to employment areas and sites. So where you have, for example, industrial estates such as this, they are covered by a designation such as employment area, which is kind of a blanket designation effect around the whole of the industrial area. Or it could be primarily industrial area, those sorts of terms. Then within that, you have available sites, which are allocations. Is that the approach that's taken in the partner authorities?
I've not come across that approach before, so we haven't got it for this plan.
I appreciate it's not in this plan, but in the lower order plan. So we're up in Broadland here. So in the Broadland, is there a designation that applies to the wider industrial estate in the Broadland plans?
No, this was an allocation in the 2015 Broadland site allocations, which we've brought forward with this allocation, with this plan.
Okay. And the issue here is one of availability. I mean, I know you do sometimes get sites that you come across that have been rolled over 2 or 3 times, but we don't know who owns it. We don't know that it's available. There doesn't appear to be a planning history on the site. No one's promoted it to the local plan. That's where I'm coming from, really. I mean, unless you've got anything further to add, I can just.
I haven't, so I take the point in entirely.
Okay, I'll reflect on that point. There's no comments on the policy in this case. Any other comments on this site before we move on? Okay, in which case we're now on site E under issue 2, which is local plan ref HAR7, land south of Spurkitts Lane. I've probably butchered that, apologies, in Halston. Again, there's an availability question here. I mean, this appears to be in a slightly different category in that it's a greenfield site next to an existing employment area with good road connections. It's obviously it's next to the main road, but there's no statement of common ground, no planning history that I've seen on the statements, unless I've missed something, and no representations to the local plan. So again, the question is about availability, really. Is there any indication about this site's availability?
I think, sir, the case in some respects is similar. We've endeavoured to reach out to the landowners, but have been unsuccessful. This is obviously an allocation that's been rolled forward since the South Norfolk site allocations in 2015. These type of developments do often take time to come forward. This location around Fuller Road is recognised for sort of employment and industrial type uses. But yes, I think the points you made about the Aylsham site in some ways apply here too.
I mean, this site, at least on its face, does look to be different from the Aylsham site in the sense that it's a greenfield site. It looks like it's been a planned extension at some point, whereas the Aylsham one, it looks like the sort of site that could have been rolled forward through several successive plans and without change in circumstance. This one looks like it's a more recent allocation just by virtue of where it is and its shape and its relationship to the existing industrial estate, whereas the Aylsham one was just a vacant piece of land in the middle of one. Is there any indication at all that it's available, that the partnership's aware of, or that it's ever been promoted for employment uses?
Obviously, the site was promoted for the 2015 South Norfolk plan. As I said, we've endeavoured to reach out to and establish land ownership and promotion activity on the site. We haven't been successful in doing that.
Okay. A couple of minor points on the policy wording. Is there a contradiction between points 1 and 4 of the policy? And where I'm coming from in this is that point 1 requires that road access be taken from the north rather than directly off the A road. And there does appear to be a belt of trees along the northern boundary of the site. And part 4 then requires that those be protected. But inevitably, some of them, certainly from what I've seen from the street images, which are quite recent, and from the aerial images, it appears that the only way you get an access in is by removing some trees, particularly if you're taking the access from the north. Sorry, Mr. Banham.
I can see the rationale of your argument. maybe this could be a policy where I think, as we've before discussed, some kind of compensatory measure for tree planting within the site, if that does require the removal of some trees.
Yeah, I think that's the correct approach to take in this case. We have discussed it on other sites, so wording along the lines of any trees or planting lost to create an adequate visibility display shall be compensated for by new frontage planting within the site. Something to that effect would do the job, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, part 7. Again, we've discussed before, but those previous comments apply here. Part 8. I think I've seen this before and skipped over it, but when I was preparing for today's session, it just jumped out to me really. Is that really a requirement that development must comply with, or is it a signpost in the way that there's a signpost to the minerals and waste core strategy? It's popped up a few times. It just struck me, you're not really looking at that as a criteria to require development to meet. Would you refuse a development if they hadn't consulted the Historic Environment Service, but had provided archaeological surveys? If there's a need for archaeological surveys, that's one thing. It's a similar point to the Highway Authority point. I don't want to make it a requirement of the development plan for any council body to be in agreement. It's the issue. If the issue is archaeology, then the policy should probably be framed in terms of archaeology rather than the Historic Environment Service. I don't have a problem with there being something in the explanatory text saying where archaeological surveys are undertaken, the Historic Environment Service should be consulted as a signpost. But I'm not sure it's really a requirement of development. That's what I was thinking. I'm happy to hear a view on that point.
I'm sure that the reference there was intended to refer to obviously the River Waveney location and the potential for archaeology. So yes, I think as we've discussed before, moving this requirement to supporting text and making it explicit that it's around archaeology is something that I'm sure we would do.
I don't have a problem with a reference to archaeology, but it's the reference to the Historic Environment Service that makes me slightly nervous, in the same way that the reference to the Highway Authority. I wouldn't want the development plan to be requiring consultation with the council body. The development plan should be requiring that archaeological impacts are addressed. That's the way around I'd see it being. It's perhaps a minor rephrasing job. And the reference to the Historic Environment Service is the bit that probably moves to the explanatory text rather than the reference to archaeology. Okay, and that probably has wider implications with other policies. So if that could be looked at on a consistent basis throughout the part two sites plan, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments on that site before we move on? Okay. Site F, then in the MIQ list, local plan ref Hethel 2. So let me call it up. This is the larger site, the counterpart to the smaller site we discussed before, isn't it?
That's correct, sir.
I've only got some minor comments on this one. There's the familiar point with regards to part 9 being moved to the explanatory text. One thing I noted with the smaller site, so 2109, that referred to an adjacent listed building, and this one doesn't. This policy doesn't. Is there a reason for the difference of approach?
Obviously, there's a difference in distance to the listed building, and obviously Hethel 2 benefits from the master planning requirement, which would take matters like heritage into account.
Okay. There is an objection from Historic England I take on board what you say, really. I'll leave it to the council, and it would be given the master planning exercise and obviously the policies in the plan that relate to heritage assets in any event, and the greater distance to the listed building. I'll if the partnership wish to incorporate that suggested wording, I think it would be additional mods rather than main mods. Okay, fine. Any comments on this site before we move on? Okay, site G in the MIQ list, which is local plan reference ACL 3, land at former station yard, west of B 1140 Acle.
So a changing of the guard, as you put it, sir, here.
Thank you, Mr. Banham. Okay. Again, my comments are detailed in nature for this site, just relating to the specific wording of the policy. To my mind, part 2, which says access is restricted because of the low bridge which crosses the road, which serves the site, limiting the size of vehicles. That just describes an issue, doesn't require anything specific. So to my mind, that's perhaps either the one for deletion or moving to the explanatory text. But I don't think it's something that belongs in the policy, really. Okay, another detailed point. Part 4 is very specific. It says there is a metered water supply to the existing station buildings. An agreement must be reached with British Rail to connect to this supply. I think, as with other policies, I'm a little bit concerned about requiring agreement with British Rail as part of the development plan. Should the policy perhaps instead focus on water supply and simply say an appropriate water supply to the site should be provided? Would that be, does the partnership have a view on that suggestion?
Yeah, we would agree with that. I think they're the 2 points that we picked up that probably needed removing or clarifying, especially with regards to point 4, as it was carried forward.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Jones, you appear to have frozen on my screen. Is it just me, or are others struggling as well?
It's Miss Jones. Oh, she's back.
Back, yeah. I'm concerned it's me, and I'm going to have to go and kick the wife off Netflix again. But okay, if it's not me this time, we'll continue. And as with yesterday, Ms. Jones, we'll carry on for now. If there's an issue, I'm sure you can move desks. Okay. 5 again is more descriptive than prescriptive, in the sense it just describes the problem. I'll leave it with the partnership as to how it's resolved, but again, that could be within the realms of just moving to the explanatory text, or perhaps reframing to address the issue, as in how it should be addressed. Obviously, it's an issue, but I don't think as point 5 is currently worded, it's really a requirement. And I think that concludes my comments on the policy. Are there any other comments on this site or policy before we move on? No. Okay. Okay, in which case we'll move on to site H in the MIQ list, local plan reference HIN2, which is land adjacent to the Hingham Industrial Estate, Ironside Way, Hingham. Let me call it. Okay, so this is the eastern expansion to the existing industrial estate. Again, I've got most of what I need from the hearing statements and the representations in terms of principle. It's just detailed comments from myself. One is a minor typographical error. The numbering starts at 7 rather than 1. I know that's easily done. I've done it myself in documents, but obviously the numbering needs to be reset to start at 1. Part 1 requires, it says just local road improvements. is it clear what those are? Does the highway authority or does the partnership have something specific in mind that just strikes me as a little vague? Is there a specific improvement that this development would necessitate?
With regards to that point of the policy, that was carried forward. I don't think there's any specific requirement in terms of local road improvements, as the only access to that part of the site would be through the existing Ironside Way on the industrial estate. So I don't think there's anything specific in terms of local improvements. It's just to ensure that there's a safe and suitable access.
Okay, I mean, it's just to ensure that requirement is justified. I mean, there's no one from the highway authority on the call today, is there?
No, there isn't.
Okay. Could I ask the partnership just to explore with the highway authority whether that's still necessary? I appreciate you sometimes have these carryovers from previous plans, because there's no point in the policy requiring local road improvements if none in fact are required. On the other hand, if there's a junction nearby that needs to be upgraded, then I wouldn't want to lose it if there's something clear and specific that's required. Okay. Part 8, wastewater infrastructure capacity, we've discussed elsewhere, so the same comments apply. Are there any other comments on this site for anyone else in the room? Mrs. Doe.
Thank you. Yeah, we just had a concern that this this policy had been included, obviously, as a rollover, which is absolutely fine, and we support the need for employment areas and would welcome that. However, we're very concerned that it hasn't been looked at in correlation to what they were proposing as housing sites, because the two share the same stretch of road, and obviously this policy is allocated to GNLP 0520 with regard to the pedestrian island in the vicinity of Ironside Way. Now, previously our representations have pointed out our concerns over that pedestrian access, and again we had the question of local road improvements. What were those local road improvements that had at one time presumably been identified to actually be included in a policy?
Okay. I think some of those concerns echo the points I made, really. I'll take a response from the partnership, but given the highway authority aren't here, perhaps this is best dealt with via a very brief note for my benefit, so I understand fully what improvements were considered to be necessary. If that policy requirement is to stay, it might be the case that you consider it doesn't need to stay, Ms. Jones, but if it is to stay, I need to understand why, what it relates to. We have had a lengthy discussion about the safety of the proposed pedestrian crossing in relation to site GNLP 052, which is the housing site to the southwest. And myself and Mr. Warden will visit that site and see it for ourselves. Do you wish to comment any further, Ms. Jones, on what's been said by the Parish Council?
Only just to confirm that we will go away and speak to Highways just to confirm what those local improvements might be, and then provide the note as such.
Okay, and from my perspective, I don't need the note if it's to be deleted. It's just
Okay.
if it's to be retained. It's just to understand what it is and why it's necessary. Again, bullet points only. It doesn't need any introduction or context. Okay, any further comments on this site? Okay, in which case we'll move on then to site I in the MIQ list, local plan reference LOD3. Land adjacent to Loddon Industrial Estates, Little Money Road, Loddon. This did tickle me, Little Money Road in a commercial area, but there we are. I'll call it up now.
I do have an update on this, if this is an appropriate time, just to before you begin.
Yes, please do.
Consent has been granted now for an industrial development with new access roads, landscaping. The proposals for 25 commercial units of EG, B2 and B8. This is approved at the end of last year.
Okay.
No commencement on site though.
That's helpful, thank you. Particularly as my first few questions were going to be about availability, that's probably answered them, so thank you. We'll just call this one up. This one. Yeah, so this site can be accessed then. I think that was my key concern. It just appeared from an aerial photograph and from the street view that there was no way into it. Presumably then, if permission has been granted, one of the adjoining land ownerships to the northeast also controlled this site. Presumably that's the way it's been accessed. I mean, it's academic if it's got planning permission. Obviously, if it's been granted planning permission, then appropriate access will have been secured. Okay. In which case, a couple of minor detailed points about the policy wording itself. Part 5, obviously previous discussions apply. Same with part 6. And from my notes, that's all I wanted to ask. Any further comments on this site before we move on? Okay. In which case, we'll move on to site J in the MIQ list, which is local plan ref POR3, which is the ex-MOD site, Pine Loke. All right. Poringland. Again, this is a site with no statement of common ground. Does the partnership know who owns it? Is it still in Ministry of Defence ownership?
We have tried to make contact, but we haven't heard anything back. We're not entirely sure of the ownership of the site.
Okay. Do you know? Are you familiar with the history of the site, Ms. Jones, or anyone else in the partnership? Was it an allocation prior to the 2015 South Norfolk plan, or was that the first time it was allocated?
We'll just have to check with one of my colleagues in case they might know.
Thank you.
We probably would need to come back to you on that one in terms of whether it was rolled forward from a previous one. In terms of the use of the site, the only thing that I'm aware of is use for the military vehicles on their site, but any further detail of the history I'm unaware of.
Okay. The policy is quite restrictive. It only allows for Class E G uses, which as I understand it is light industrial. What's the reason for restricting it in that way?
My understanding is, given the nature of the equestrian use surrounding the site to the east, and then the residential, I think in terms of what would be appropriate, this is why the Class EG was restricted on there.
Okay. Is the access appropriate for employment uses? Because certainly when again, this is going off street view, I'll undertake the detailed visit in the weeks ahead. It looked to be a very constrained access, a very narrow access with potential visibility issues. It's in effect a single lane track. And from the street view image, which is August 2021, so around the time, well, just before the time we conducted our initial site visits in any case, it looks to have a large mature hedge along one side that would potentially restrict visibility. But the route itself is very narrow. Is that something that's been considered in allocating this for employment purposes?
I don't think it's been considered further than from the previous allocation. I think we are aware that the site is heavily constrained with the telephone masts that are on the site, so we are aware of other site constraints on this site.
Okay, I mean, from what I've got before me, it's not clear that it's available. I mean, obviously the access relates to suitability, but there's just nothing on whether it's ever been promoted for development I appreciate if you're not familiar with the history of the site, then prior to the last allocation, I appreciate that's going back some time. Then that's fine. Really, it's just for me to understand whether there's a realistic prospect of this site coming forward for the use envisaged within the plan period. Like I say, it's not clear that it's available, and that access does look to be highly constrained, particularly for a commercial use. I appreciate light industry is by definition appropriate to a residential area, but nonetheless you will get commercial vehicles. And given the size of that site and the long access between it and Poor England Road, it's kind of a backline, it has a backline character to it really. Then you could easily get conflicts along a very narrow lane like that between larger vehicles or indeed smaller vehicles. Okay. Are there any comments or responses to those thoughts?
No, just in terms of it, obviously it was a carry forward allocation, as we said, and we had tried to make contact with the owner, and we've had no formal withdrawal, so it just seemed appropriate to carry it forward. But no further comments than that.
Okay. Just in terms of the detailed policy wording, points 6 to 8 relate to discussions we've previously had, so I'll just make that comment here as a note, really.
Okay.
Any other comments from anyone else on this site? Okay. We'll move then on to the village cluster sites under issue 2. Is there a changing of?
Yes, there is.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Which is site? Okay, so it's site K in the MIQ list. Local plan reference SL 2007/GNLP 4061/HNF 3. Okay, so land at Abbey Farm, commercial. Horsham St Faith. Okay. My first question relates to the site boundary, and which does appear slightly odd at present in 2 respects. One is that there is an area of land in between the existing settlement boundary to the east and south of this site. It's like a finger of land between the edge of the allocation and between the settlement boundary and the existing commercial area itself, which I understand from the representations is a bund that's intended to be incorporated within the site redevelopment. That's the first question. The second question is it appears to incorporate the allocation parts of the existing commercial park. Does the partnership wish to comment on the site boundary in light of those 2 points that have been raised by the site promoter, please? Thank you.
Yes, as you've said, the site promoter has raised comments through the stages of consultation and requested amendments to the site boundary to take account of the issues that you've just raised. We wouldn't have any objection to making those amendments. They seem to be reasonable alterations.
Okay. I think it does appear to be an anomaly at present. Particularly, this is one of the sites that has recent planning permission as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it's my understanding that it was considered at committee back in July 2021, and it was delegated approval subject to the satisfactory resolution of drainage and ecology issues, on which I believe discussion is still ongoing currently, and hopefully close to resolution.
Okay. If the partnership's of the view then that the boundary should change, and obviously that's the position of the site promoter, then I think that should be added to the list of main modifications, please. Are there any comments from the site promoter on the discussion so far?
Morning, Inspector. Thank you. I think all just to add that, whilst this is only quite a small change, it is actually very important, and the existing bund does form a quite important part of the proposed development site. Also, just to add that we are very close to the planning permission being issued for the site. We're just resolving the drainage issues, and the reason for that is because we're submitting a detailed drainage design at this stage. Again, it just demonstrates the intention of the landowner to obviously commence development as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. And does the planning application boundary reflect those two detailed points we discussed, in that it includes the land between the existing commercial area and the allocation, but excludes the area of the commercial site that's been already developed? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It excludes what we call Block L, which is the area that's built out, which forms part of that blue area, but it does include the bund, which will be removed to facilitate this development.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's helpful. Just a couple of detailed points on the policy wording itself. With relation to part 2, I think this probably echoes points I've raised elsewhere. The wording, to my mind, lacks a bit of clarity in the sense that it uses the term improvements to the highways network may also be necessary, which might include. I think that needs tightening up, really, and particularly if we have a detailed application, which presumably the Highway Authority has been involved in. Perhaps part 2 could have those words replaced for clarity, but also perhaps reflect what's been agreed with the Highway Authority through the detailed consideration of the application. I think that's just needed to make the policy effective. Any thoughts on that from either the partnership or the site promoter?
I think from the partnership's perspective, yes, we'd be happy to make those changes.
I think that's fine. I think just in terms of the detail on that, there is a new vehicular access that is proposed to service this area, and no upgrading is actually required to the A140 Church Street junction, and that has all been agreed with the Highway Authority.
Okay, thank you. If the policy could reflect what's been agreed through the more detailed consideration of the application with the Highway Authority, I think that would be helpful. Are there any other comments on the detailed wording of the policy? No. Okay. In which case then we'll move on to the next site. It's coming up to 11 o'clock, isn't it? We'll do this last site. We're not at 11 o'clock just yet, and then we'll break for middle of the morning. Just have a look at the MIQ list. My sense is that we're making good progress, but we just have a quick look. Okay, we are making fairly good progress. We'll deal then with the its sites L in the MIQ list, local plan reference FOU2, which is land at Old Railway Yard, Station Road, Falsham. Okay. This is another one where the availability of the site seemed unclear. There's no statement of common ground. No planning history is referred to in the hearing statement or elsewhere. No one sought to promote it to the local plan itself. Can the partnership shed any light on that point, or indeed on the history of the site and whether it's one that's been rolled over in successive local plans? Thank you.
Yes, the site has certainly been rolled over from the 2016 Broadland local plan. I'm unaware if it was in previous iterations of the Broadland local plan. Yes, you're correct, we have no statement of common ground. I've checked and we do have some contact details on file, so we would have tried to make contact with the details that we have, but obviously haven't had any success with that. As my understanding is that there has been no recent planning history on the site There does appear to be some existing development to the east of the site, which appears to be a sort of motor engineering company, and the allocation itself is adjacent to a small industrial development called Powley's Business Park. So it is in an area with existing sort of commercial employment type development.
And is that to the south? That's the area with the settlement boundary.
Yes,
where the
it
settlement
is.
boundary wraps
Yes.
around like a salient to the south.
Yeah.
Okay. I think this is another one where the access looked, unless it could be accessed through the existing employment area to the south, and it wasn't clear that it could, given it's like in a U shape, isn't it? That
Yes.
Existing business park to the south. So it's not clear that an access route could be achieved through there. And there's a bungalow next to it again. Moving to the eastern periphery of the site, I note the business that's there at present, which has its own separate access. There then appears to be another access, which is tree lined on either side, very, very narrow, and extends into the main body of the site. And certainly from the aerial photographs, that looks to serve at least one residential property. It's not clear to me that that access is what you would want to see in a commercial development. It's very long, very narrow, no obvious passing places, trees on either side. If you've got a residential property in the middle, it looks like it has. I don't know that it has. My concern here stems from the fact that there was a time many years ago in planning where availability considerations weren't as central as they are now. When you have sites that get rolled over and over again, it's whether the original rationale for allocation was the same as the tests that apply today, and whether the rationale still exists. I mean, this looks to be a highly constrained site. It's partly in flood zone 3. It's next to a sewage treatment works, very narrow access, potentially serving a residential property as well. It's not really clear what's on the site. There appears to be a couple of buildings. What they relate to is unclear. I mean, it's not clear to me that there's a reasonable prospect this site is going to come forward in the foreseeable future, really. Happy to take a comment from the partnership on those observations, but it looks to me to be doubtful at best, really. Do you wish to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I accept the points that you have made, and that there does look to be some constraints on the site. I mean, obviously we would be looking to sort of try and retain employment opportunities in villages if possible, but this is a reasonably small site, so we can go away and investigate some of those constraints further if that would be helpful. But I think at the end of the day, if it was considered that the site was too constrained to come forward, then it wouldn't be a significant loss in the terms of the employment land in the plan.
And it's another one perhaps myself and Mr. Warden will visit. It comes back, I mean, I appreciate the point about employment opportunities in small settlements, but it's whether this even qualifies as an opportunity at this stage, and it might need a more elastic definition of that word to qualify. It's the main body of the site, aside from the small section at the front where there's the existing business, the rest of the site looks to be, well, I'll go have a look at it and take my own view. But what I've got in front of me doesn't fill me with confidence that it's a realistic opportunity in that regard. Okay, you've heard my concerns. A couple of quick points on the policy wording. Again, these are detailed in nature and can probably be resolved through fairly minor changes. Part 1, it's just the terminology that's used. If the second sentence says significant information will be required, should that just say a flood risk assessment will be required? That's far clearer than significant information. part 2 for me points to the fact that this terminology isn't used in any other policy. The existing vehicular access off Station Road may prove suitable. I think
Agree,
that
that's
perhaps
not very
points to the
helpful, is
problem.
it?
Well, I read that and it almost confirmed to me that the access is questionable. Let's say it's either it is suitable or it isn't suitable. May prove is not helpful really. Okay, 6 and 7 we've discussed elsewhere. Those same comments apply. Okay, any final comments on this site before we break for mid-morning?
I haven't got any further comments there.
Okay. Okay, like I say, we've made very good progress so far, so we should finish with plenty of time for lunch. We'll take a break now until 11:30 and return then and look to conclude on this matter. Thank you all for your contributions. The hearing sessions are adjourned for now. Thank you. Okay, it's now 11:30 and time to resume the hearing sessions. Before we broke for mid-morning, we've made pretty good progress on the MIQ list, so I'd anticipate we'll be able to conclude well before lunch. We'd reached site M under issue 2 on the MIQ list, which is local plan reference HNF2/GNLP 0466R, land east of the A140 and north of Norwich International Airport, Horsham St Faith. Question for the partnership to start with. I understand that a planning application for this site was submitted in October of last year. Is there any further updates on that, please? Thank you.
I've had some recent discussions with the case officer, and as far as I'm aware, that application is currently progressing. I don't have any more updates as such as a date when it might go to committee or anything like that, but my understanding is work is ongoing to progress it.
Okay, thank you. There was an objection to this site in the Reg 19 reps in terms of the boundary. Has that now been resolved through the application process, or is that?
My understanding is the planning application boundary is slightly different to the allocation boundary in that it does include the land that goes down to the Broadland Northway. There were a number of different sort of boundaries submitted through the plan process, going from a much smaller boundary submitted initially through to another one submitted through Regulation 18 consultation, which again was different from the Broadland local plan boundary and different again from the current planning application boundary. So I think even if we'd adopted the revised boundary submitted through the plan process, it would be different to the current application boundary. And I don't think we would have any objection to changing the current allocation boundary to reflect the planning permission boundary, or conversely leaving the boundary as it currently stands and allowing the planning application to progress separately.
Mr. Knowles, you've got your hand raised. Did you wish to come in?
Thank you, sir. I am building partnerships with developers for this site. The planning application is in, as you correctly say, and hopefully we should get determination ideally this month, but probably next month. We were looking for a couple of things: regularisation of the boundary, because the wording, the previous wording, left there was uncertainty about where the Northern Distributor Road, Broadland Northway, would land, and therefore the wording allowed for the land between the allocation and where the northern boundary of Broadland Northway was. What we're asking for is just a regularisation so that the boundary is contiguous, so it falls on the allocation along the northern area of the NDR.
Okay. Thank you. My understanding from what's been said from both the partnership and from Mr. Knowles is that the boundary was awaiting the detailed route of the road. Is that correct, Ms. Baker? The boundary was left undetermined because the precise route of the road was unclear at that time in the early stages of preparation.
Yes, I think when the Broadland local plan was being progressed, yes, I think the boundary of the road was uncertain, and as I say, I don't think we'd have any objection at all to changing the allocation boundary to reflect the planning permission boundary and take it down to the Broadland Northway.
Okay, I mean, obviously that would make sense to have the boundary there rather than in the position it currently is, particularly if there's no particular reason why the southern boundary is as at present. Obviously, the only rider to that is I'm not familiar with the application itself, nor is that really to come anywhere near my remit. So if there's no objection through the application process to the boundary that's proposed there, and in fact the site is intended to include that southern element, and there's no reason for it not to be included, that should be added to the list of main modifications, I would have thought. It certainly makes sense in terms of having a clear boundary and edge to the site for it to be the road than where it currently is. Okay. it's been drawn to my attention again in the Regulation 19 representations that the current broad and local plan policy states that only those employment uses which have a significant specific benefit from a use being located near the airport will be permitted. So that's the plan as things stand. What's the reason for taking a different approach in the current policy? Thank you.
We had some discussion about this earlier in the sort of plan making process, and we agreed that a relaxation on the stipulation for the airport related uses could assist in delivering development in this site, which is a key strategic location for employment growth.
Okay. Mr. Knowles, do you have any thoughts on that point?
Oh, yes, I would agree with that. The amount of demand we're having certainly supports the fact that we should take away a restriction on airport-related uses.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Those were all the questions I had from the information before me in relation to the principle. I did have one detailed comment. Sorry, Mr. Knowles, did you have an additional point you wanted to make? I've just seen your hands raised.
Can I make an additional specific point, sir, please, and also a general point? The specific point relates to the policy wording, which restricts the uses to any use no more than 50% of the total floor space in any one use class.
Okay, I mean, I was about to move on to the detailed wording of the policy. We can do that now. Is your position that should be changed, Mr. Knowles?
Yes, sir. That was put in place ostensibly because of the generation of what was then B1 office car movements onto the NDR junction, and I think if there is a restriction, then I think the restriction needs to be to what was B1 now E classes, and possibly restricting it less than 50%, because with competition to the uses in the city centre under NPPF, I think we wouldn't want to see 50% offices on this site, and I don't think the planners would either.
What's the reason for this requirement, Ms. Baker? I mean, as currently worded, it just basically seeks to resist a maximum 50% with any one use class. So you could have no more than 50% of the site as B2 or B8 or offices. Is it offices, EG, or is EG something different? I've got my use classes order here. Obviously, E now is far more expansive than it ever used to be, to the delight of planners everywhere. Okay, so EG, it's the old B1, isn't it? Yeah. So office, research and development, or light industrial. Okay.
Perhaps, sir, I can help out with the initial question: is what was the purpose?
Please do, Mr. Morris.
Given that I go back almost as far as Mr. Knowles, the purpose is at the early stages of this this proposal, when it came forward into the broad and local plan, and the what was then called the NDR, the Broad and North Way, with the uncertainties around the impact of either, then it was felt appropriate to limit to no more than, and it's really about no more than 50%, what was then B1, because of the traffic generation issues. Clearly, time has moved on, and as Mr. Knowles says, we're certainly not looking for this to be an office park, and sort of B2, B8, and appropriate sui generis uses would be preferred. So this restriction, as we would still need to make sure there's a restriction on the office uses because of the traffic generation as well as impact on the city centre. So we would need something along those lines. But if you would like us to go away and just revisit, just to make sure it's still appropriate from the highway perspective, then we can do so, obviously in consultation with Mr. Knowles.
If the concern relates solely to offices, so e.g., and not to B2 and B8, it doesn't make sense to apply the maximum of 50% to B2 and B8. It just makes sense to apply it solely to the office uses. And if it is specifically offices rather than, for example, light industrial or research and development, I mean, I'll leave that one to you and to your highways colleagues, really, then perhaps it might be better to be more specific still than simply e.g. So if I call up my my use classes order, so EG1 is offices, isn't it? If that's where the key, I think I'd like the policy to be as specific as possible if it's going to apply restrictions. And if I understood your point correctly before, Mr. Knowles, you wouldn't have a concern if that restriction was applied solely to offices as long as it was lifted on the other potential uses. Is that a correct understanding of your position?
That's correct, sir. Okay.
In which case, if that's the aim, if that was the kernel of the partnership's concern, then I think that policy needs to be reworded to laser in on that one issue rather than applying the test to all uses on the site. Okay. I've got a comment on part. Sorry, Mr. Knowles, did you wish to come in?
Just that after consideration, and I don't know if you've finished the detail on the wording, sir, I would just like to make a comment generally, which may help.
I had a couple more comments, but I'm happy for you to make a general comment as well, Mr. Knowles, if you wish to come in.
It was really to pick up on Mr. Morris's comment earlier on to do with Longwater when he said that, and I think from discussions that's accepted that there is sufficient provision generally for employment within the plan. I don't agree with that statement. And the reason I don't agree with this statement is because to use a football analogy, the goalposts have moved in the last 2 years. We're involved with Savills on a number of developments, including Ipswich, where we've got an application at Copdock Interchange for employment. Their view is that in 2020 there was a change in employment requirements. And in 2020, there was in terms of distribution, a record transaction of 51 million warehousing transactions. That was broken in 2021 to 55 million, 25% of which was taken by Amazon. And if you look at Norwich generally, I believe that is shown in Norwich on our site that we're discussing here. We took an assessment that the gross 100 acres would take about 30 or more years to build out, which is consistent with delivery on historic delivery on sites. We've currently got interest and some occupiers in legal hands with about 40% of the site already. So all of phase 2, most of phase 1. And if you look around Norwich, you have Brawland Gate in much the same position there. They were 48 acres from memory. They've only got, after 2 years, 8 acres left. If you look at south on it, Apex Business Park on the 140, they've just sold to Canmore for 285,000 square feet for delivery of spec industrial units on what is a site of 300,000. So 25 acres out of 30 is gone. So I would ask, if possible, whether there is a general discussion on employment delivery and numbers, particularly around the southern bypass, where the research park and the food hub are both restricted to their to specific uses, and therefore there is a very real shortage of land around the southern bypass.
Okay, I think in general terms we covered all those matters in relation to strategy, in relation to whether the employment land requirement was correct in weeks 1 and 2. My understanding, and Mr. Morris can respond in due course, is the reference to oversupply is against the requirement identified in the various studies the partnership have produced of employment land requirements, which has generated a land requirement. And their position throughout has been that the sites they've identified significantly exceeds that requirement. So Mr. Morris can answer for himself. That's what I understood when he made that point. I don't wish to revisit in any detail matters we've already been through, because we had discussed this at length. I see Mr. Curran's got his hand raised. I'll take a very, very brief point if it's not relating to this particular site. I'll get a very brief response from the partnership, but I don't intend to divert this discussion into points we've already considered at length. Thank you, Mr. Curran.
Yeah, thank you, sir. It was just basically to pick up on exactly what Mr. Knowles has just said in relation to the employment provision. And like I said, I don't want to go brief into depth into the strategy, but just hearing today about the specific sites, there's a number of sites that seem to be delayed, not coming forward, not delivering what sort of is on paper what's needed, and particularly in relation to rural development and paragraphs 84 and 85 of the NPPF. I'd just like to raise some concerns about actually what's going to happen in some of these more rural locations if the allocations aren't coming forward in a timely manner, and are we actually impeding in terms of the delivery of necessary infrastructure and opportunities? Because like I say, paragraph 85 goes on about we should be delivering and exploiting any opportunity in rural communities to help develop and make them more sustainable. And I think through new employment allocations, or even just some flexibility in policy 6 to allow sort of sites to be brought forward through the plan period, would be a useful way to sort of be more coherent and more responsive to the requirements of the NPPF. And yeah, I just think, is there any scope there in terms of making policy 6 more flexible in this regard?
We've been through policy 6 in detail. I don't propose to revisit policy 6 today. That's the discussion that's been had, really.
Okay.
And like I said, I don't want to divert this session into areas that it wasn't intended to cover, particularly when we've had an opportunity for a full discussion on more strategic matters in weeks 1 and 2. I'll take a brief comment from Mr. Morris on the points that have been raised, if he wishes to respond, and then I want to get back to the individual sites. Thank you.
Thanks. Just to reiterate that the most recent economic evidence we had done was produced in late 2020 and was taking account of at least the early signs of the COVID impacts. When it looked at the requirements for employment land, from memory, it came up with somewhere in the region of 70 odd hectares, and we have in excess of 300 hectares of available land. Where I would agree with Mr. Knowles is that we do seem to be seeing a stronger take up of employment land in recent years at locations like Broadland Gate than we might have expected before. But we've still got plenty of opportunity. We've only just discussed the site just over the road from Mr. Knowles' site, where there's 40 hectares, half of which will be for general employment use. So I don't see there's a particular shortage, and as you say, so we've discussed these issues in the first sessions.
Okay.
Can I just bring something else to your attention? I'm not sure, looking at what we've said so far, that we've made it clear that there's actually on this site that we're discussing, the access road has been put in, and there is a waste transfer station operating at the end of it. It's right over on the sort of eastern side of the site. So in terms of delivery of the site, it's progressing well.
Okay, thank you. We were discussing the detailed wording of the policy. I've got a couple of additional comments, and I'm happy to hear further comments from the site promoter as we go through it. Part 2, this is, again, will echo comments I've made before. It's the use of, sorry, 1 second. It's not part 2. I think I've referred to the wrong section here. Sorry, just give me a second to find the point I've mislabeled it in my notes. Here we go. It's point 9, not point 2. Again, it's a detailed point. Highway improvements may be needed to upgrade the junctions to deal with traffic generated by the development. It's point 3 as well. Access to be provided directly from the A140, fine, with possible second point of access. It's these ambiguous words which we discussed before, I don't like. I think the wording needs to be far clearer. I think where we do have a live application that highways have been involved in, I think there's the opportunity to refine the wording in light of the more detailed proposals that have come forward as well. So that's the comment there, really. Mr. Knowles, did you have any further comments on the detailed wording of the policy? Obviously, you've made a comment about point 1 already.
No, sir. I think your point's a good one. I mean, we I think should discuss the specific wording with the JNLP and cover the points, including the point you just raised.
I wonder if there's a parallel in point 5 of the policy, part 5 of the policy, to the concern we discussed with regards to point 1. Again, that seems to refer to, it says that, well, it says it's envisaged, which itself is unclear. The amount of floor space in one use class will not exceed 50%. So it's a note to the GNLP in updating part 1 to make the corresponding update to part 5, please. And there's the familiar point in relation to part 11 about the Norfolk Minerals Waste Core Strategy Policy. Okay. Any final comments on this slide before we move on?
No, sir.
No, sir. Okay,
thank you. In which case, we'll move on to site N in the MIQ list, which is local plan ref BKE 3, Brook Industrial Estate in Brook. Just call this up on my map. Okay. There's a couple of points on this site, and again, I'm going off the aerial photographs and the street view, so I'm happy to be corrected if I've misunderstood those, or if indeed the information on those is out of date now. It looked to me, at least from the aerial images, this site was entirely developed, in that it was covered by existing uses and was largely occupied. Is that a recent development, or has it been in that condition for some time? I mean, particularly, does at the base date of the plan period, was this site largely developed out for existing commercial uses? I think is the point I'm driving at.
Yes, sir. This allocation has certainly been carried over from the 2015 local plan, and as you say, much of the site is now developed. It's an area that's grown incrementally over the last few years to become an established employment area. I've had conversations with the monitoring officer at South Norfolk Council, and he's informed me from the monitoring that he's conducted. His belief is that 1.2 hectares of the 4.8 hectare allocation is currently available, but there have been no new permissions granted recently. But I would comment the same as you, sir. I had a look on the aerial photograph and it does look like the site is mostly built out. I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, I thought that there may be areas where perhaps a better use of land could be had, and that might be the 1.2 hectares referred to.
I mean, the point I'm driving at, you've probably gathered, really, is an allocation is usually an area of land identified for new development. If this site, in effect, is an existing employment area, then it isn't really an employment allocation in that sense. And I'm not sure that you can really, it's reasonable to say that there's a 4.8 hectare allocation here.
Yeah.
From the aerial images, and again, that's not definitive, and I would defer to someone who's been out on site, obviously, but it looks like the entire site's used for commercial premises. Whether there's a judgment been taken about a hectare being potentially an opportunity for being used slightly better, well, if it's currently used by a commercial operator, then it isn't necessarily available, is it?
No, I would agree, sir.
Okay, and that's the point I'm driving at, really. Are there policies in the lower order plans that seek to retain existing employment sites? Presumably there are, and therefore would it be best that this site be captured by those rather than an allocation?
Yeah, I don't think we'd have any objection to that, sir.
Okay, thank you. In which case, add that to the list of main modifications. I'm about to go through the detailed policy wording. Is it your view that this should be deleted as an allocation per se?
Yes, I think we'd be happy with that, sir.
Okay. If that's your view as well, like I say, it seems to be mine from the aerial images, if that's the view of the partnership as well. And that's not to say, just so there's no misunderstanding, that's not to say that those uses shouldn't be retained or this site is an inappropriate employment area. I'm not making that judgment at all. It's purely that if it isn't available for new employment uses, then it really doesn't fall within the remit of what an allocation is supposed to cover. Okay. In which case, I won't go through the detailed policy wording, albeit some of the points, well, given they're so minor, I may as well. 5, explanatory text, the final bullet point. 4, significant information to be replaced with flood risk assessment. The Norfolk Wildlife Trust asked for a reference to be made to the county wildlife site, which adjoins the site. Were this to be retained, then given the approach that's been taken elsewhere, I think that would be important for consistency. Okay. Fine. Any final comments on that site before we move on to issue 3?
Only to say I think there's a change of personnel now from the partnership.
Fine. I'll give you a second to swap over. Thank you, Ms. Baker. Okay. There's only 5 sites under issue 3, so we should get through these reasonably good time. Okay. First one is in Norwich. It's A in the MIQ list, local plan reference R30, land at Holt Road, Norwich. Okay, I've seen the statement with regards to the planning permission on this site. A couple of detailed comments to be made about the policy wording itself. 7, we move to the explanatory text as previously discussed. Part 6 says ensure that any development is designed to comply with the requirements of Norwich Airport with regard to airport safeguarding measures. 2 points here. One is that the principle of, in effect, deferring or giving the weight of the development plan to the requirements or the opinion of another body, I don't think is appropriate. So I think to comply with the requirements of Norwich Airport, well, their requirements might be unreasonable. The development plan can, and it's imprecise in that regard. We don't know what their requirements might be, and they might not even be planning matters. So I don't think the development plan should be worded in that way to give the weight of the development plan to their view, Norwich Airport's view. With regard to airport safeguarding measures, what's the crux of the concern here? Is it due to the flight path? Is it the position of the runway? Is it those sorts of issues, or is it something else?
I think it would be those issues, sir. Yes, but we're happy to take this away and review the wording to that policy. I can understand your concern there, sir.
Okay. That'd be helpful, just so it's exactly clear what it's referring to, and again, so that the policy, part of the policy is directed towards the issue rather than the body, in this case, Norwich Airport. Other than that, I don't have any comments on this site. Does anyone else wish to comment before we move on?
No comments from me, sir. Okay,
fine. Okay, in which case we move on to site B in the MIQ list, which is local plan reference COL2/GNLP 0140C. Let me just call it one up. Again, this is a site with planning permission, so my comments are really directed to the policy wording. It's the same point again with regards to part 2 of that policy, just to move it to the explanatory text. I don't have any other comments to make on this site. Does anyone else wish to comment on it before we move on?
I agree with your point there, sir, and I have no other comments to make.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. Okay, site C on the MIQ list, local plan reference COL1. This is the umbrella policy, as I understand it, to the wider Norwich Research Park. Is that correct, Mr. Walker?
That's correct, sir, yes.
Okay. I've just done a keyword search through the part 2 sites plan to find it, and it's coming up. There's another site that's got the same reference, COL1. That's a carried forward housing allocation at Coltishall. I think the resolution to that is I've asked the partnership to merge that residential allocation because there's an existing one and a proposed extension to it. Perhaps it would be helpful just to give it a different name than Col 1 once that merging has taken place. It's not helpful for two different sites to have the same reference number in effect.
Appreciate that point, sir.
Here we go. Apologies. A point of clarification to start with. It's not entirely clear from my perspective exactly the geographical extent of policy COL1. I appreciate it's supposed to be an umbrella policy that covers the entirety of the research park. But does it also cover the proposed allocations we've discussed? So that's the smaller site to the west, which is GNLP 0331BR, the expansion to the south, which is GNLP 0331CR, and the other allocation to the northeast, which is GNLP 0140C/COL2. Is it intended to cover the entirety of the existing research park in addition to those proposed allocations?
So far as I understand it, so Col 1 has its own boundary, which is separate to those other boundaries. The other policies, 0331BR and CR, refer back to this one for its requirements, but the boundary for Col 1 is as per the adopted local plan for South Norfolk.
So it's in effect, it's what's shown as the settlement boundary on the map on page 174 of the sites plan, Part 2 sites plan.
The settlement boundary would come under Col 3, I believe. Col 1 is the blue area.
Okay.
The shaded blue area, the blue wash area. So the employment allocation, but not the areas which are covered by 0331 CR and BR, which those two, the 0331s, fall outside of that purple dashed settlement boundary at present. Is that clear, Sarah? Is that still okay?
It's clear on where COL1 applies, and that's helpful. The problem then arises is that you're right in saying that the two extensions to it, to both the smaller one to the west and the larger rectangular sites to the south, both refer back to policy COL1, but strictly speaking are outside of its boundary. Is it in effect one site? Is COL1 the carried over allocation and the two sites next to it essentially expansions in this plan? Is that the approach that's been taken?
That would sound like the appropriate approach, so yes.
But is that the approach that the council's taken? You have the COL1 site.
It is, sorry, yes, sorry, I should have been clearer, yes, sir.
Okay. Should this just be one allocation rather than three separate ones?
Yes, sir, we would agree with that approach, or we'd be happy to take that approach to have it, if all adopted, to carry that forward as one allocation.
But is there any reason why it wouldn't be one allocation? I don't want to suggest that to you if there's a good reason why it shouldn't happen, but it would overcome the practical constraint, the practical problem that you have sites referring to a policy which doesn't apply to them, seemingly.
Yep, no, we'd be happy to include those all together, sir, as one allocation. I think we're talking about the Col 1 0331BR and 0331CR. Could I just clarify? Are you talking about the Col 2 0140C as well, or
not necessarily?
No,
I mean, those
no.
aren't contiguous with that site, really. That isn't contiguous with those sites.
No, I appreciate it.
Is the situation here analogous to some of the housing allocations we've discussed, where you have an existing one from a previous plan and a proposed extension? They've been given two separate policies and numbers, despite being in effect one site. Is it the same here?
That's correct, sir. Yes.
Okay. In which case, I think it would make sense to merge the policies just to avoid any ambiguity or lack of clarity into the geographical extent of the policy. And particularly the other two policies, the two smaller policies, don't say an awful lot and in effect defer the detail to Col 1 in any event. So I don't think much would be lost.
Agreed, sir.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Has the cumulative highways impact of all of these sites been assessed and reviewed by the Highway Authority? Because I know that's the point the parish council were keen for me to raise. Thank you.
Could I call in my colleague Phil Morris on this to assist with that answer, please, sir?
Yes, please.
Yes, so the highways, as we've said before, the Highways Authority has been fully engaged in the site assessments of throughout the plan, and also both the Cole 1 and the Cole 2 areas are covered by outline consents, and so would have been covered under those. So yeah, in short, the answer is yes.
Okay, and it's the cumulative impact of Cole 1, Cole 2, plus the 2 expansions to Cole 1. That's all been factored in.
Yes, sir. This site is very important to the economic strategy of the area, and the county council are fully engaged in bringing it forward and helping where they can.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. We'll move on then to the detail of the policy wording. The master plan requirement is one I wanted to ask a few questions about. And it does refer back to a previous master plan. So is there an existing master plan in place, or is the expectation that a new one would be provided? And if so, at what stage is any new master plan required?
There's an existing master plan for this, sir.
Okay. Because the policy applies to the wider site, then in effect you're asking for a new master plan for the wider site, aren't you, through part 2 of the policy? And it says to have regard to the existing master plan. Does that mean it would supersede it? That's my reading of the policy at present.
Yes, that sounds like an appropriate reading, sir. Yes, that's correct.
Mr. Carpenter, you've got your hand raised. Did you wish to come in at this point?
Yes, if I may, sir, just for clarity, we act for Bullen Developments again, the owners of part of Cole 1. It might be just helpful for clarity just to define that for you. If you draw a line, so I'm looking at the local plan allocation plan and the blue wash area, and if you look at a line that runs east-west and goes just over the top of number 1 in Cole 1 and meets Heatherset Lane.
Okay.
If you draw that line and then go north along Heatherset Lane to Watton Road.
I don't have the road names listed
right.
on. Let me just call up Google Maps.
Okay.
So does the ownership? Sorry, I'm looking at an aerial image now, Mr. Carpenter. So if you could start that description again, please.
Okay, so if you find Heatherset Lane running north-south,
yes,
through Cole 1, and then just where Cole 1 is written on the designation plan, there's a line as a boundary that runs east-west from Heatherset Lane back towards the developed area, which creates a square with a funny point at the top of land. All of the land to the west and to the south of those lines is owned or optioned to Bullen Developments. The land to the north of and east of those lines is owned by Anglia Innovation Partnership, which is, and they've sort of euphemistically been called NRP North and NRP South, but both parties work together, so it's all effectively dealt with as one park.
And do Bullen Developments also control the 2 proposed expansions to Cole 1 to both the west and south?
We do, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That reiterates to me then that it needs to be a single allocation.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's fine. I just wanted to pick up on the point of the master plan. The master plan that exists for here is an illustrative master plan that was submitted at the time of the application for planning permissions. So there are two outline two planning permissions, outline planning permissions on the site. One covers the area owned by Anglia Innovation Partnership, and the other covers the area of Cole 1, not the extension areas, the Cole 1 in Bullen's control. So both of those permissions are extant. They run till 2027, I think, and reserve matters have been submitted on both sites over the time since planning permissions were granted. The illustrative master plan that we're talking about was an illustrative master plan that was associated with the planning permission for NRP South, and the reserve matters applications have in part followed that illustrative master plan, not in whole, because the marketing of the site and the interests of the end users was slightly different, and that's why it was always ever an illustrative master plan. It's followed the principles of that master plan, but it has not followed the master plan to the letter of every single line that was drawn on it. And we'd be concerned, I think, if we had a master plan that became suddenly terribly prescriptive, because that wouldn't reflect the way this site has developed, with end users coming forward wanting very specific, because of the nature of their uses, wanting very specific sites, very specific buildings, and very specific accesses to the adjacent hospital.
So in that context, where most of the site has planning consent and has an illustrative master plan, which subsequent reserve matters applications are following, what purpose does Part 2 serve? What additional master plan, which is what it's requiring at present? What's the reason for that, and what will it achieve, and why is that requirement there? Those questions to the partnership, please. It does seem to, it appears to me to introduce an element of confusion to the situation, but I'm happy to be guided by any response or to hear any contrary views.
I think the policy is a carryover policy, clearly, from the existing plan, and although it has been reviewed, I think the intention behind point 2 is to refer to the approach that Mr. Carpenter has outlined. The only thing I would emphasise, though, is the elements that follow the requirement for a provision of master plan includes phasing in relation to delivery of infrastructure, integration with existing uses, provision of high quality buildings, landscape strategy, green infrastructure plan. Those are all elements that we would want to see. I'm not familiar enough with the cases in the same way Mr. Carpenter is. Those may all have been part of this master planning approach, but clearly they are important elements of a high quality research park. So while being too prescriptive about how those are delivered, I can understand your concern, but I still think they are elements that are very important to the ethos of the park, and I think the delivery of the park is fulfills those requirements so far. So we would hope to see that continue.
I think my concerns relate to the very first part of Part 2, and it might simply be the case that a very brief or a very minor alteration to the wording addresses them. I don't have any concerns after the bracketed section, which that includes semicolon, phasing in relation, all of those points we've just run through. Perhaps it should say proposals within Col 1 should have regard to existing approved master plans or existing illustrative master plans, and include something along those lines. I'm sure you can think of better wording, and that would achieve the aim without introducing the uncertainty that the current wording does. Mr. Carpenter, do you have any thoughts on that point?
Yes, just this might provide some comfort. There is, in order to discharge the conditions of the outline planning permission, there is what we've called a joint phasing plan that was required by one of the conditions, and also a public realm strategy. And during the course of the development of this site, we've been in discussions regularly with South Norfolk Council, Norfolk County Council, and everybody involved in bringing this site forward to keep those documents under review. and indeed there is a current review ongoing for the joint phasing plan, and we are now beginning separate to that, talking about a review of the illustrative master plan, just so that all parties that are involved in bringing this part forward are singing off the same piece of paper effectively, and guiding ourselves in the right way. But all of that's done through the planning permission rather than through any requirement of a local plan policy.
Okay. I think it's a detailed issue that could be resolved through an appropriate rewording of the first line and the first 2/3 of the second line of point 2. I'll leave that with the partnership to consider. It's a detailed point, and it could be addressed through relatively straightforward wording changes, I think.
Thanks, sir. We're comfortable with that.
Okay. A couple of other detailed points under the design and landscape heading, which is on page 173. There's a requirement for achieving BREEAM very good standards for new construction. That isn't in any other site-specific policies, and obviously this is the strategic policies in part 1 of the plan which cover those matters. So is it appropriate to specify that standard here, or necessary indeed?
As you say, sir, it is covered under the general policies. I believe this is also, a continuation of the existing policy approach on this allocation, and it has been carried forward. Clearly, it's within the. Again, it has been useful to emphasise the point for this research park, and I'm sure many of the buildings, all the buildings, are of very high quality and achieve something like these standards. So, I think. I suppose what I'm trying to get to, sir, is it's probably not necessary anymore because it's covered under the general policies, but it has helped to deliver a high quality park up till now.
Okay, it's probably not a sound. Reflecting on it, it's probably not one for soundness really. I'll leave that with the partnership to consider. Really, it isn't necessary to remove it for the purposes of soundness. Okay. Final comment on the detailed policy. Constraints section. All this does really, the last 2 points we discussed elsewhere, 8 and 9. With 6 and 7, it just lists the constraints. If there's a requirement for an FRA, then obviously that's fine. Perhaps just 6 should be rephrased as well. Actually, reflecting on this, it just needs to be 8 and 9 addressed as previously discussed. Otherwise, I think 6 and 7 is okay.
Okay.
Just one final point, a general point on this. We did discuss the issue when we were discussing I think it was policy 6, and I mentioned to you about the need for specifying about conditions to restrict consent under various components of Class E. Are you content that if that clause was introduced there, that would prevent, for example, the change of use of buildings consented here, which is clearly an important part of the partnership's economic strategy? Are you content that a clause in the part 1 of the plan would cover you for applying conditions to prevent changes of use to other or changes within Class E, effectively? I mean, I think it was yourself, Mr. Morris, who had the discussion with.
Yes, I think that's covered by part 1 of this policy. Acceptable uses will be research and development use under Class E G2.
Fine. It might just be helpful to add, and this is to strengthen your hand in any appeal were it to reach that point. Conditions will be used to prevent changes within Class E in order to protect the function of the area and to prevent the proliferation of town centre uses in out of centre locations, something like that. Okay, we've all got to deal with Class E now, which is obviously incredibly broad. I appreciate the focus here is for a research and development park, which falls under Class E, but in order to achieve that on new consents, it's going to need to be conditioned, and were those conditions to be challenged and appeal, you'd be on much stronger ground if there was a statement of that nature within the policy.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay. Any final comments on this site before we move on? Mr. Carpenter.
Yes, sorry. Just to take your point there, sir, and not to disagree with it in any way at all. So there's no suggestion that we're attempting to change the use of the buildings we've already got consent for or will do in the future. But just to, in a note to the partnership in thinking about the appropriate words, don't forget that condition 13 of the original planning permission has some words in it which we were all happy with, which includes a certain square footage for ancillary and complementary uses as detailed in the NRP development framework supplementary planning document. So that's not to suggest that we are suggesting anything else, but I think that was an idea that there were going to be sort of meeting rooms, coffee shops to serve the park, not to compete with town centre uses. So in looking at those words, perhaps just remember that there are some uses which would be ancillary to the principal use of the site.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. Just a few sites left to cover now. We're moving to the main towns now.
Sorry, sir, we have a change of personnel as well. So.
Oh, sorry. Yes, of course.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Okay. Site D in the MIQ list, local plan ref AYL4, land at Dunkirk Industrial Estate in brackets east, south of Banningham Road, Elsham. Let me call it up. Okay. With this site, I've got everything I need from the hearing statements, so there's no further comments from myself. Does anyone else wish to comment on it before we move on? No. Okay. Site E, land north of Spurkitts Lane, Harleston, which is local plan reference HAR6. As I understand it, and again, this is from aerial images, so apologies if that information has been overtaken by events. But that appears to show the majority of this site is developed with very little remaining or very little available left. Just scroll to it on the interactive map. Did that development of the site take place before the base date of the local plan?
No, sir. We had there was some storage on the site which dates to an application in 2013. The commercial unit was a 2018 permission, so part of that development would have happened after the base date of the plan.
Okay. Perhaps if the hectareage could be revisited. Obviously, if a site's come forward within the local plan, then that counts towards the local plan supply. Okay. A couple of detailed comments on the policy wording itself. Part 2 requires a pedestrian and cycle links to Spurkitts Lane. An apology if I'm mispronouncing that.
No, that's fine.
Looking at the Spurkitts Lane, it appears to not have any pedestrian footway along it. And the street view image is April 2021, so it's up to date. The question is simply, if there's no pedestrian footpath along that road, is there really a need for a pedestrian connection to it? Because where would they go after they've reached Spurkitts Lane in effect? They can't walk along it.
Yes, no, I see the point. I mean, obviously we have got other development proposals in that vicinity which will provide footpath and cycle links in due course.
Is it intended to provide a footpath link across the entire northern edge of Spurkitts Lane? if it is, if that's the case, and I hadn't appreciated that wider point, then I don't have a concern with the requirement. But there did appear to be very new tree planting in the location where any footway would go. At least along the northern edge of Spurkington.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll leave that with the partnership to reflect on.
Yeah.
If there's a clear
Thank you,
justification for it, fine. But obviously, we don't need a connection to a footway that doesn't exist or won't exist in the future.
Thank you.
Part 4 says contribute towards green infrastructure protection or enhancement along the Waveney Valley corridor. Does that mean contribution with on-site landscaping, or does it mean an off-site contribution to a project via Section 106?
No, that would be limited to the site itself.
Okay, fine. Final comment relates to point 6, and again, I've made comments on that clause elsewhere, so the same comments apply.
Thank you.
Okay, any final comments on site HR AR6 before we conclude? Okay, thank you. In which case, we've concluded matter 13 in reasonably good time. Discussed with Annette earlier, there's no intention to bring forward the afternoon session given the number of participants, so that will resume at 2 as usual. Just like to thank you all for your contributions, and we'll adjourn the hearing now and return at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.